Redditor 1. I've never told anyone this before, but I still remember the day when the past bled into our present in a way that would haunt my dreams for years to come. I was just a teenager when my parents finally decided to reveal the dark history of our home, a secret they'd guarded for as long as I could remember. Our house, a creaking relic that had been in the family for generations, held stories that were whispered in hushed tones and locked away in dusty photo albums. It was one of those old houses with an eerie charm, its walls saturated with memories of lives that once were, lives that ended in tragedy. It all began on a cool autumn afternoon when my dad was busy cleaning out our old camper. We were getting ready for a much-anticipated road trip, and he had taken it upon himself to clear out the clutter that had accumulated over the years. I remember the sharp smell of stale air and old leather mingling with the musty odor of forgotten memories. As he worked, a car slowly pulled up along the gravel drive. I stood at the window, half curious, half dreading what might come next. The vehicle was an old sedan, its paint faded like the remnants of a forgotten past. Out stepped a woman with a determined look in her eyes, and she walked right up to our door without hesitation. My dad, always polite despite his rough exterior, answered the door with a cautious greeting. "Yes, I do live here," he replied, his tone measured but guarded. The woman explained that she was in town for a class reunion and had come to see if our house was still standing, a strange question that hung in the air like a cold mist. She then asked if he knew what had happened here. My dad, confused by her inquiry, shook his head slowly and said, "No, I don't." That's when she began to speak, her voice trembling slightly as she recounted the grim history of the house. She told him about a family that had lived in our home in the late 1000s, a family that included a mom, a dad, and a daughter. According to her, the father worked overnight at the local refinery, leaving the family in the care of the mother. One dreadful night while the father was away, the mother suffered a severe mental break. In a fit of inexplicable anguish, she grabbed the family shotgun and, in one horrifying moment, ended the life of their young daughter. Consumed by grief and unable to bear the weight of her actions, she then took her own life. The father, upon returning home from work, was met with the unbearable horror of his loss, and he died a few weeks later of what was attributed to natural causes, though many whispered that his heart simply couldn't survive the shock. My dad listened in stunned silence, his eyes growing distant as the weight of the story settled over him. Later, he went to the local library and found records confirming every detail. The old news clippings, yellowed with time, painted a picture of a troubled family whose lives ended in a cascade of unthinkable sorrow. My parents had kept this story from my sister and me, believing it would only serve to frighten us. They thought the truth of the past was better left unspoken, locked away in the recesses of our home's history. But that was not the end of the haunting. Months after that unsettling encounter, my dad was alone one day, renovating an old storage room in the house. I remember the day clearly. The light was dim, filtering through grimy windows, casting long shadows on the floor. My sister and I were at school, and my mom was at work, leaving my dad to his solitary task. He was removing an old cork board that had been hanging on the wall for as long as anyone could remember. As he pried it away, he paused, his hand frozen mid-movement. He said later that he felt an overwhelming sensation of being watched, as if someone or something was standing right behind him in that cramped, dusty room. My dad's voice, usually so firm and unyielding, had trembled slightly as he recounted the moment. "It was like a presence, not something I could see, but something I knew was there," he told me in a low, serious tone. As he continued to remove the board, he suddenly heard a thud, a dull sound as if something had been dropped. He turned, and there on the floor lay a set of dog tags. I'll never forget the look on his face, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a creeping, inescapable dread. Those dog tags belonged to the father of the ill-fated family, the man whose life had shattered long ago in this very house. My dad was convinced that the ghost of that man had made its presence known, insisting that he find the tags, as if it were some final, silent plea for closure. The fact that this eerie encounter happened in what is now my bedroom, a room that once belonged to the child whose tragic fate had been sealed by the madness of his mother, sent a chill straight through my soul. It was as if the restless spirit was reaching out, its spectral hand touching the past and the present in a single, unholy gesture. Since that day, our house has become a tapestry of haunted memories. There have been other stories, whispered in the dead of night, that hint at the violent, sorrowful energy that lingers in every creaking corner and shadowed corridor. We've learned that the house, built upon a foundation of tragedy and death, holds the echoes of so many horrid deaths and shattered lives. Each ghost, each restless spirit, is a fragment of the past that refuses to fade away into oblivion. I often think back to those moments with a mixture of fear and reluctant fascination. I remember sitting in the living room on a stormy night, the wind howling outside as rain battered the windows, when I heard a soft, almost imperceptible clink coming from the storage room. I went to check, my heart pounding in the silence, and found nothing out of place, except for the lingering echo of that ghostly presence. In that moment, I realized that our home was more than just a building. It was a living entity, a repository of sorrow and loss where the past and present intertwined in ways that defied explanation. My parents never spoke of it often, perhaps out of a desire to shield us from the darkness that resided in our family history, or maybe because they too were haunted by the ghosts of that dreadful past. But as I grew older, I came to understand that our home story was not just one of tragedy. It was a reminder that the past never truly dies. It lingers in the silence of an abandoned room, in the faded photographs on the mantle, and in the unexpected appearance of something as mundane as a pair of dog tags. I still remember the day vividly, the day when my dad's voice trembled as he recounted the story of the lady in the car and the tragic events of the late 60s. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the sky is a relentless sheet of gray, and the world outside seems to be mourning along with you. I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of lukewarm coffee in my hands, listening intently as he described the horror that had once unfolded in our house. The details were so precise, so vividly recorded, that I could almost see the ghostly figures wandering the halls, their eyes haunted and sorrowful. That conversation marked the beginning of a deeper understanding for me. I began to notice things. A door that creaked open without a touch, the faint scent of old cologne lingering in a room long after it should have dissipated, and the occasional inexplicable draft that seemed to whisper secrets of long-gone lives. I started to document these occurrences in a journal, a silent testament to the fact that our house was alive with memories, both beautiful and terrible. There are nights when I lie awake listening to the symphony of creaks and whispers that echo through the corridors, and I feel a profound connection to those who once walked these halls. The ghosts are not malevolent, not in the way that nightmares often portray them. They are simply echoes, remnants of lives that ended too soon, stories that are too painful to let fade away into oblivion. I've learned to accept their presence as part of the fabric of our home, a constant reminder that the past is never truly gone. Even now, when I walk through the storage room where my dad found those dog tags, I feel a shiver run down my spine. I pause at the doorway, listening to the silence, and I swear I can almost hear the soft murmur of a voice, as if someone were calling out, urging me to remember. It is a haunting melody, one that carries the weight of sorrow and regret, yet it also speaks of the hope that, even in the darkest of histories, there is a chance for redemption, a chance to learn from the past and move forward. My sister sometimes teases me about being too sentimental about our old house, but I know that the stories are real. They are etched into every crevice, every piece of worn-out wood, and every faded wallpaper. I've come to understand that our home is more than just a shelter. It's a guardian of secrets, a silent witness to the tragedies and triumphs of those who lived and died within its walls. I have often wondered what would happen if I were to confront these ghosts more directly, if I were to try to communicate with them, to ask them about the stories they carried. But then I remember my dad's cautious tone when he recounted the lady's story, and I realized that some secrets are best left undisturbed, like fragile relics that must be preserved rather than explained away. The ghosts of our home are not monsters to be vanquished. They are memories, living and breathing in their own way, deserving of respect and quiet contemplation. Sometimes on a rainy afternoon when the sky is as gray as a funeral shroud and the wind howls like a chorus of lost souls, I sit by the window and watch the rain slide down the glass. In those moments, I feel a deep, inexplicable sadness mixed with a sense of peace, a feeling that, despite the tragedies that occurred here, life continues, stubbornly and beautifully. The past may be dark, but it has shaped who I am, giving me a profound appreciation for the fragile beauty of life. I've never been one to fear the ghosts that haunt our home. In fact, I've grown to accept them as part of my everyday life, a constant reminder that even in the midst of sorrow there is a story worth telling. And so, every time I hear a creak in the hallway or catch a glimpse of something moving just out of the corner of my eye, I remind myself that these are not intruders, but echoes of a past that refuses to be forgotten. In the end, our house is a tapestry of memories, woven together by the threads of love, loss, and the relentless passage of time. It stands as a testament to the idea that the past is never truly gone. It lives on in every whisper, every shadow, and every unexpected discovery, like the dog tags that once fell to the floor in the quiet of an old storage room. And though these memories may sometimes send a chill down my spine, they also fill me with a strange sense of comfort, a reminder that I am part of something much larger than myself, a story that spans generations, etched into the very walls of the home I call my own. Redditor 2. I've never told anyone this before, but my house is haunted. I grew up in an old, creaking structure that held secrets far older than my memories. The original part of the house was built in 1945, a time when every floorboard whispered stories of a bygone era. Later, in the early 1960s, my grandparents added a back half and an upstairs wing for my father and his 3 siblings. Even now, the building's history is as fractured as its walls, and every shadow seems to carry a memory. I remember the first time I truly grasped the eerie legacy of our home. My father once told me that when they first moved into the front part of the house, a neighborhood kid warned him that the old couple who once lived there had died within its walls. They said the wife had died in the bathroom, and later the husband passed away in what is now our dining room, once his bedroom. As if that wasn't enough, during the construction of the later addition, the man building the new stairs suffered a heat stroke and died right on the job. His son finished the work, and the house, with its layered past, seemed to breathe with the souls of those who had perished within its confines. Growing up, I had my fair share of unsettling experiences. I was a timid kid with an overactive imagination, yet I swear these incidents were all too real. I would often catch a glimpse of a figure standing next to me in the hallway or lingering at my bedroom door. Sometimes, when I turned to confront the apparition, it would simply vanish, as if it had never been there. I remember one evening when I was watching a movie in my room. My sister was supposed to be sleeping in the bed next to mine, but as I burst into laughter at a funny scene, I glanced over and saw an empty space. The sudden absence of her presence left me feeling hollow and inexplicably ugly, as though the very notion of being watched by something unseen had stripped me of my worth. There was also the night of a friend's sleepover that remained seared in my memory. I was recounting the ghost stories of our house, the legend of the ghost that roamed the stairs, to her. I'd always found the story both funny and terrifying, a mix of childhood superstition and an uncanny sense of foreboding. We were in my room, the door closed tightly, when the unmistakable creak of someone ascending the stairs echoed through the silence. I told myself it was perfect timing for my story, a coincidental reinforcement of my words. But then, out of nowhere, my door swung open with a force that made my heart plummet into my stomach. I scrambled to hide my fear, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, though deep inside I knew it was something far more sinister. My friend's terrified cries filled the room as I forced a laugh and muttered reassurances. All the while my mind screamed that nothing about this was. The door, always so stubborn and hard to open, had flung wide on its own, as if an unseen hand had pushed it open. At night I dreaded the darkness. My father, ever the pragmatist, would leave my door slightly ajar and switch on the stair light when he left for his night shift, believing that a sliver of illumination might ward off the unseen. We lived with my grandparents, and their room was right next to the staircase, separated by those old windows that had once been part of the original house. They never bothered to remove the windows when the extension was added, and the light would spill through at odd angles, unsettling my grandfather. Sometimes, late at night, I would wake up in utter darkness, only to find that my door was left cracked open. In those moments, I could feel an unyielding presence standing just outside my bed, watching me as I tried to force myself back to sleep. One memory that still sends shivers down my spine dates back to middle school. I had woken up in the dead of night to get a glass of water. I couldn't see a damn thing without my glasses, yet I knew my house like the back of my hand. I made my way downstairs through the pitch-black corridors without stumbling, until I reached the long hallway leading to the kitchen. There, out of the darkness, I saw a figure I believed to be my grandmother. I called her name softly, but she didn't respond. As I moved closer, my heart sank. The figure wasn't my grandmother at all. Its form passed right through me, brushing along the left side of my arm and shoulder with an icy chill that made the hair on my skin stand on end. Goosebumps erupted all over me as I spun around and bolted back upstairs, my footsteps thundering in the silent night. My father, who was in the room next to mine, heard me stomping and rushed in, only to find me trembling and pale. I told him what I had seen, and he dismissed it at the time. It wasn't until months later, when he experienced something similar, that he admitted he'd also felt a cold, spectral touch in the dark. High school brought its own strange chapters into my haunted narrative. I was a straight-A student with my life mostly in order, until I began to share a secret habit with my dad, smoking weed. It sounds reckless, but we never used it to go out or cause trouble. We kept it hidden, a small rebellion against the ordinary. My grandfather passed away in 2013, just as my senior year was beginning, and I had almost put the habit on hold out of respect. One day, my dad said casually, "I have a nug, you want to smoke?" And I agreed. I sat on the cold wooden floor, taking a slow drag from the joint. As I exhaled, I noticed the smoke spreading out in front of me like a living, undulating thing. I couldn't decide if it was my imagination or something else entirely, until my dad suddenly yelled, "It's Lito!" The nickname we used for my grandfather. The sound of his voice, the sudden clarity of that moment, sent a shiver down my spine, so profound that I didn't smoke weed for several months afterward. In the weeks that followed, strange occurrences piled up. Lights would flicker ominously whenever someone mentioned my grandfather's name, and I'd sometimes hear the jangling of coins, like the sound of change rattling down a long, empty hallway. My grandfather was known for always carrying a ridiculous amount of change in his pocket, a fact that now took on an eerie resonance. For many years, the supernatural episodes subsided into a haunting background hum, until recently, when a new terror emerged. My grandmother, who now suffers from Alzheimer's, has had a hard time sleeping. About 2 months ago, I was walking downstairs to the restroom when I turned a corner in the hallway and heard the loudest, most bone-chilling exhale, a sound that seemed to emanate right next to my ear. The sheer force of that sound startled me so badly that I tumbled to the ground, my entire body tensing in terror before I scrambled back upstairs. The exhale sounded distinctly like my grandmother's, yet there was something unnervingly inhuman about it, as though it had been warped into a ghastly mimicry. I called out for my dad, and we rushed back downstairs with my dogs in tow, half expecting to find an intruder. We checked my grandmother's room, expecting her to be awake, but she was fast asleep, undisturbed by the noise. I tried to explain what I heard, but even now I cannot put it into words without feeling the chill of that moment. Since then, whenever I walk downstairs at night, I instinctively cover my ears, terrified of hearing that exhale again. The house itself seems to have a life of its own, its history bleeding into the present like an open wound that never heals. Each creak of the wooden floors, every sigh of the wind through the cracked windows, is a reminder of the lives that once inhabited these halls and the tragedies that marked their final days. I sometimes imagine the old couple wandering the halls, their silent despair echoing through empty rooms, or the ghost of the stair builder still laboring on in eternal repetition. The sound of footsteps on the staircase, which my dad confirmed after experiencing it himself months later, still reverberates through the night. It's as if the house mourns its past, reliving its grief in sporadic bursts of inexplicable phenomena. Living in this house, I've learned to be constantly vigilant. I never feel completely safe, even in the supposed sanctuary of my room, where the only light is the dim glow of a street lamp sneaking through the window. There's an unsettling energy that permeates every corner, a feeling that I am never truly alone. Even now, when I sit quietly in the living room, my eyes fix on the old staircase, I sometimes swear I see a shadow flit across its surface, a brief, inexplicable glimpse of someone who isn't there. I've tried rationalizing these moments as tricks of the light, the product of a tired mind burdened with too many ghost stories, yet each time, a deep, primal fear reminds me that some things defy reason. There are nights when I lie awake, staring into the darkness of my room, listening to the silence that seems to press in on me. In those moments, I feel as though I am being watched, not by an intruder, but by the collective ghosts of the house. I can almost feel their presence, a cold, relentless gaze that follows my every movement. I remember one particular night when I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. I lay there, heart pounding, until I mustered the courage to pull back the covers. The door was ajar, swaying gently as if disturbed by an unseen hand, and I could sense a figure lurking just beyond the threshold. The terror was so acute that I couldn't move, my mind frozen in a state of shock, until the first light of dawn began to break through the darkness, and the figure seemed to dissolve into nothingness. Sometimes, in the quiet after midnight, I catch snippets of whispers, half-heard voices that seem to murmur from the walls themselves. They speak of loss, of sorrow, and of unfinished business. I try to ignore them, convincing myself that it's merely the old pipes groaning or the wind playing tricks on my ears. But deep down, I know that those voices belong to the ghosts that haunt this place, souls forever tethered to the tragedies of their past lives. My haunted house has shaped who I am. Its history, steeped in death and despair, has woven itself into my daily existence. The fear is not just in the ghostly apparitions or the unexplained sounds. It's in the knowledge that I live in a place where the past never truly dies. And every night, when I walk down the creaking stairs or hear that soul-stirring exhale in the hall, I am reminded that I am part of a story far larger and far darker than any one person can comprehend. I still wonder what it all means. Are these apparitions echoes of lost souls, or remnants of the tragedy that built this house? Perhaps the house itself is cursed to forever replay the anguish of those who once lived here. I have no answers, only the persistent, gnawing fear that there is something beyond our understanding, lurking just beyond the veil of the everyday. And so, I live with this knowledge, haunted not only by ghosts, but by memories and regrets that echo through these ancient walls. I cover my ears when I walk the hallways at night. I leave the light on in my room despite the fear of drawing unwanted attention, and I constantly question whether the next creak or shadow might be the ghost of a life long lost, reaching out to me. In my quiet moments, I feel a deep, inexplicable sorrow, an aching awareness that the house is alive with the remnants of its tragic past. I have learned to accept the haunting as part of my life, a constant companion that I cannot escape. But every time a door swings open on its own, every time a chill runs down my spine in the dead of night, I am reminded that in this house the dead do not rest easily, and in that truth lies the unending horror of my existence. Redditor 3. I've never told anyone this before, but I used to love paranormal stories as a kid. I would devour books about real ghosts and mysteries, letting my imagination run wild with every spine-chilling tale. I remember spending countless nights under the covers with a flashlight, reading about haunted houses and vengeful spirits, convinced that the unknown held secrets waiting just for me. Then one day, I watched an episode of Sightings, Ghosts, that changed my life. It wasn't a typical ghost story. It was about a ghost couple that haunted a family. The mother, with a voice steady as steel, confronted the male ghost and told him he was not allowed to harass or frighten her children. And just like that, the ghost stopped. That moment seared itself into my young mind, etching the belief that if you're afraid, the hauntings only grow worse, like a bully who escalates when intimidated. But if you stand up to them, if you refuse to give them permission to hurt you, they recede into the shadows. In my teens, I began to see something that defied explanation, a single black orb that hovered at the edge of my vision. It wasn't like the gentle, ethereal lights I'd read about. This orb was darker than the deepest shadows in my house. It would drift silently, always avoiding my gaze, as if it sensed my presence and retreated out of respect. I grew accustomed to its quiet movements, watching it from afar, waiting until it had passed before resuming my daily routine. It was eerie yet somehow benign, a solitary visitor that didn't intrude on my life beyond its silent, spectral appearances. Then one night everything changed. I was lying in bed, the room cloaked in the comforting darkness of midnight, when suddenly I felt a blinding pain in my right eye. It was as if a forceful blow had struck me, leaving an agony that radiated through every nerve. I bolted upright, my heart pounding, convinced someone had just punched me. In the pitch-black silence of my room, I scrambled to the bathroom. I flicked on the harsh overhead light and stared into the mirror, half expecting to see swelling or bruising, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. My face was as normal as ever. Only the skin around my right eye felt tender, as if a massive bruise had formed beneath it, even though no evidence of injury marred my reflection. Every blink sent fresh waves of searing pain through that spot, a reminder that something inexplicable had just occurred. I returned to bed, my mind racing as I tried to understand what had just happened. But no sooner had I settled down than another sensation struck, a feeling of being poked, jabbed repeatedly at the bruised area. It was as if an invisible finger was prodding me, deliberately tormenting the spot on my eye. I rolled to the left. The poking ceased for 2 agonizing seconds before resuming with renewed intensity. I rolled to the right, burying my aching eye into the pillow, desperately trying to escape the intrusion. Yet the intermittent prodding persisted, each pause too brief, each jab a piercing reminder of that inexplicable attack. In a moment of raw anger and fear, I sat up abruptly, my heart hammering in my chest, and yelled at the unseen presence. "Stop it! You do not have permission to touch me. You do not have permission to hurt me. Get your effing hands off me." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, as if my words had broken a spell, the poking sensation ceased and the pain in my eye began to ebb away. I lay back down, exhausted and shaken, and eventually drifted back to sleep, though my dreams were haunted by flashes of darkness and unseen hands. The next morning, I awoke to find my face and eye feeling entirely normal, as if nothing had ever happened. No bruise, no lingering ache, no visible mark of that dreadful encounter. A few nights later, while the house was wrapped in the same heavy cloak of midnight, I awoke to an altogether different horror. I was lying in bed when I noticed a silhouette at the edge of my vision. A tall man wearing a hat, standing silently next to my bed. I later discovered that people often refer to such figures as a hat man, shadow person, an omen that chilled me to the core. I must have been tangled in my blankets, yet I managed to jump to my feet, suddenly finding myself standing on the bed. I faced that dark, faceless figure head on. I couldn't see his face or his eyes, but there was something about the way we locked gazes. It was as if we were the only 2 beings in the room, locked in a silent battle of wills. I stood there, my voice caught in my throat, and stared back without flinching. The figure did not speak. It simply stood there for what felt like an eternity, before dissipating into the darkness as suddenly as it had appeared. After that night, I knew I couldn't continue living in a state of fear and uncertainty. I decided to take control, to refuse the power these entities held over me. I began researching ways to cleanse a space, and I learned about sage, a sacred herb used for purification. Determined to reclaim my home, I gathered bundles of sage and proceeded to sage every corner of the house. I started with the doors and windows, speaking firmly as I passed through each threshold. Negativity and malignancy are not welcome here. I seal this portal against you. I moved through every room, including the one where I'd encountered the Hat Man, infusing the air with the aromatic smoke of burning sage. With every pass, I repeated the incantation, and gradually, I felt the oppressive weight in the house begin to lift, as though a dark shroud had been peeled away. That night, after the cleansing, I held a small bundle of sage under my face. The smoke swirled around me, and despite my usual severe allergies to smoke, this sacred herb did not provoke my symptoms. Instead, as I inhaled deeply, I felt a profound sense of relief and empowerment. I whispered to the smoke, "Negativity and malignancy are not welcome. I shield my body and soul from you." With that, I exhaled slowly, watching the tendrils of smoke drift away, carrying with them the remnants of fear and despair. In that moment, I felt lighter, as if the oppressive presence that had haunted my nights was finally retreating. Since that night, I haven't seen the black orb or encountered the Hat Man again. The painful episodes, the invasive prodding in my sleep, and the spectral figure that had dared to stand by my bed have all ceased, leaving behind only echoes of a time when the paranormal seemed to dictate the rhythm of my nights. I often think back to that transformative episode on Sightings Ghosts and realize how it shaped my understanding of these encounters. The idea that fear gives power to those who haunt us and that courage can diminish their hold became a quiet mantra in my life. I began to see the ghostly encounters not merely as random acts of terror, but as challenges that I could overcome if I refused to be a passive victim. Now, as I walk through my home with the lingering scent of sage still in the air, I feel a cautious sense of control. I know that the ghosts of the past still lurk in the hidden corners of this old house, their whispers woven into the very fabric of its walls. Yet I also know that by standing up to them, by asserting my right to live in peace, I have taken away their power. There are still moments when a chill runs down my spine, or when a shadow flits across my peripheral vision. And in those moments, I remind myself of the night I shouted at the darkness. I remember how my defiant words silenced the unseen tormentor, how my courage broke through the cycle of fear. I can still recall the sensation of that blinding pain in my eye, the way it seared through me, leaving me raw and vulnerable, only to be replaced by an overwhelming determination. I remember the moment I locked eyes with that faceless tall figure, feeling an odd mix of terror and resolve that propelled me to stand my ground. And I remember the cleansing ritual, the sound of my voice echoing through the empty rooms, banishing the remnants of negativity with every firm declaration. It was in those moments that I learned the true nature of fear, that it thrives on our submission, on the energy we give to it. And once we reclaim that energy, the hauntings diminish, the shadows recede, and the ghosts become nothing more than fading memories. Even though I still live in the same old house with its creaky floors and weathered walls that hold decades of sorrow and secrets, I now walk its halls with a sense of cautious peace. I keep my eyes open and my voice ready to challenge the darkness, knowing that I have the strength to refuse consent to the unseen. I no longer fear the night as I once did, because I understand that the power of fear lies in our willingness to accept it. Every time I hear a creak in the hallway or see a shadow move where it shouldn't, I remind myself, I have the power to say no. I have the power to stand up to the ghosts and force them back into the darkness from which they emerged. And so, in the quiet moments before sleep, as the house settles into a hushed, almost reverent silence, I breathe deeply and prepare myself for whatever may come. I have learned that the true battle is not against the specters that haunt these old walls, but against the fear that dwells within us. With each defiant word, each cleansing ritual, and each act of courage, I reclaim a little more of the light that the darkness has long tried to steal. In this old haunted house, I have found not just a history of ghosts, but a personal journey of strength, resilience, and the unwavering belief that if you stand up to the terror will eventually stand down. Redditor 4. I've never told anyone this before, but that night in college changed the way I viewed the darkness. I'd always heard the stories about the ghost of an RA who had died in our building, a persistent rumor that circulated among freshmen and upperclassmen alike. They said his spirit still roamed the hallways, patrolling the floor and keeping an eye on everyone, as if he were still on duty. I never truly believed it, until one fateful night, when I experienced it for myself. It was around 2:45 in the morning, and the dorm was silent except for the low hum of the central heating system and the occasional creak of old pipes settling. I couldn't sleep. A restless feeling had kept me awake, and eventually thirst forced me out of my bed. I decided to get a drink from the communal fountain, a single drinking fountain positioned in the middle of our floor, a relic of some bygone era that still served its purpose. The corridors were empty as I walked slowly, my footsteps soft on the worn carpet. The air was cool, almost too cool for a summer night, and I felt a slight shiver as I passed under the dim, flickering overhead lights. As I rounded the corner near the stairwell, I distinctly heard the door there open and close. The sound was deliberate, a heavy, echoing creak that resonated in the quiet hall. Then came the sound of footsteps. Not just any footsteps, but ones that carried the telltale squeak of athletic sport pants. those familiar, synthetic shuffles that always seem louder than they should be on a hard floor. I paused, my heart giving a small, involuntary skip, and strained to listen. The sound was coming from just around the corner, moving slowly in my direction. I stood perfectly still, every nerve on edge, expecting to see someone emerge from the shadows. But when I peered around the corner, there was no one there. The corridor was empty, illuminated only by the weak glow of the exit signs and the pale light filtering from closed doors. The footsteps, however, continued. I could hear them moving past me, trailing off toward the double doors at the entrance of the stairwell. I watched, transfixed, as the double doors shuddered ever so slightly, as if nudged by an unseen force. It was then that a cold certainty settled over me. This had to be the ghost RA. I didn't drink any water that night, not because I wasn't thirsty, but because I couldn't bring myself to face the drinking fountain after what I'd just heard. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence following the strange noises filled with an oppressive tension. I didn't feel panic, oddly enough. Instead, I felt a calm acceptance, a realization that perhaps this was just another routine night in a building where the past still clung stubbornly to every corner. I told myself, as if reassuring a frightened child, it must be the RA ghost checking that everything's in order. I wasn't upset. I was just curious. Too curious, perhaps, for someone who should have been terrified. I slowly made my way back to my room, every step measured and deliberate. My mind replayed the sound of those footsteps over and over, the creak of the door, the slight movement of the double doors. I couldn't decide if I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew what I had heard. The stories I'd grown up with suddenly weren't just tales meant to scare college freshmen. They were a part of my reality now. I locked my door behind me, a feeble attempt to shut out the remnants of that spectral presence, and lay back on my bed, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Over the next few days, I found myself drawn to the hallways at odd hours, not out of fear, but out of a need to confirm what I had experienced. I began to wander the corridors in the quiet of the early morning, listening for that unmistakable creak of the stairwell door or the soft, rhythmic shuffle of footsteps that might echo with the sound of athletic pants. Each time I would stand silently, my eyes scanning the dimly lit corridors, waiting for a sign. And sometimes, in the deep stillness, I would catch a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a soft thud, a barely audible whisper of movement, and then nothing. It was as if the ghost RA was there, watching, but never daring to fully reveal himself. I remembered how the story was told to us when we first moved in. The older students spoke of the RA ghost with a mix of reverence and amusement. They'd say that on quiet nights, you could almost see him patrolling the halls, his presence a reminder of the life that once pulsed through these now empty corridors. I recalled sitting in the lounge with my roommates, half joking and half serious, about how the ghost must be checking on us, making sure we didn't get into any trouble. In a way, his presence was oddly comforting, a silent guardian in a place where loneliness and isolation often reigned supreme. I began to notice details I'd never paid attention to before, the worn pattern on the carpet in the hallway, the way the light from the exit signs bounced off the faded paint on the walls, and the subtle scent of disinfectant mixed with the mustiness of an old building. Everything felt layered with history, as if the ghosts of past lives and tragedies lingered in the very fabric of the place. And every time I walked by the stairwell, I felt a chill that wasn't just from the cool air. It was something more, an intangible presence that sent a shiver down my spine. One particular night stands out in my memory. It was around 3 a.m, and I had been lying awake in my room, listening to the rhythmic tick of the old clock on the wall. The silence was almost tangible, a heavy blanket that draped over every sound. Then I heard it again. The door to the stairwell creaked open, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, the squeak of those athletic pants echoing in the corridor. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, not out of fear, but out of a deep, intense curiosity. I wanted to know if this time the ghost RA would show himself more clearly. I got out of bed and crept toward the door, careful not to make any noise. I opened my door just a crack and peered out. The hallway was dark, lit only by the occasional flicker of a fluorescent bulb. I stood there for several long seconds, straining to catch any sign of movement. Then I saw it. A slight movement near the double doors of the stairwell. The doors, old and heavy, shuddered as if something brushed against them, and for a split second, I thought I saw a faint, indistinct shape move past me. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the echo of its presence in the silence. I didn't call out or try to interact. I simply stood there, my breath shallow, and let the moment pass. In that instant, I understood that the ghost RA wasn't there to harm me. He was simply a lingering echo of a life that had once been, a watchful presence whose duty had transcended death. I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness, as if I had witnessed something profound yet tragically inevitable. That night, as I returned to my room and lay back down, I couldn't help but smile a little. I had faced the unknown and found that it wasn't nearly as terrifying as I had once imagined. It was simply... In the days that followed, I found that my fear had been replaced by a quiet resolve. I continued my nightly walks through the hallways, listening for the ghostly sounds of the RA. I began to document my experiences in a small journal, writing down every detail: the time I heard the door creak open, the exact sound of the footsteps, even the slight movement of the double doors. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I was simply trying to understand the presence that had so profoundly affected me. Each entry was a small step toward accepting that my world was bigger, darker, and more mysterious than I had ever realized. Sometimes I would share these experiences with my closest friends, who had their own stories of strange occurrences in the dorm. One of them told me about a time when he swore he saw a figure standing by the vending machine at 4 a.m, only to vanish when he approached it. Another recounted a tale of hearing soft, indistinct whispers in the empty lounge. We didn't laugh or dismiss these stories. Instead, we treated them as pieces of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that hinted at the possibility that the college building was a nexus of restless spirits, each with their own story to tell. What's most remarkable about my encounters with the ghost RA is how calm I remained during the experience. I don't drink, and I certainly don't do drugs, so I was fully aware of every sound and sensation. When I heard that unmistakable creak and the shuffle of those athletic pants, my first thought wasn't panic. It was, it's just the RA ghost doing his rounds. That realization, that I had the power to not be afraid, filled me with an inexplicable strength. It was as if I had won a small battle against the darkness, a victory that emboldened me to face the unknown with open eyes and a steady heart. Now, years later, whenever I walk through a darkened hallway or hear the faint sound of a door creaking open, I remember that night and the ghost RA. I know that I was not alone in that experience. I was part of a legacy, a tradition of whispered stories and quiet encounters that have haunted the corridors of our college dorm for decades. The ghost RA remains an enigma, a spectral reminder that the past never truly fades, that the line between life and death is as fragile as the creak of an old door in the dead of night. I still document these experiences even now, long after my college days have passed. They serve as a reminder that the world is filled with mysteries that defy explanation, that sometimes the most unnerving encounters are the ones that occur when we least expect them. And each time I recall the soft shuffle of athletic pants echoing in an empty hallway, I feel that same quiet determination that allowed me to stand my ground that night. I understand now that fear is only as potent as the energy we give it, and that by facing it head-on, we can reclaim our power. So, if you ever find yourself alone in a dark dorm hallway in the middle of the night, and you hear the door to the stairwell creak open, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, remember my story. Know that you have the strength to face whatever ghostly presence may be there, whether it's the ghost RA wandering the halls on his eternal patrol, or some other echo of a life long past. In that moment, take a deep breath, stand tall, and let your courage be your guide. Because sometimes the very thing that haunts us is simply trying to remind us that we are never truly alone, that the past lives on in the quiet whispers of the night, waiting for us to acknowledge its presence without fear. Redditor 5. I've never told anyone this before, but there was one evening that seared itself into my memory. A night when the woods seemed to whisper secrets of a past too mysterious to fathom. It was during my senior year in college, when my sister, my mother, and I decided to take an impromptu walk along a winding country road in rural Northern California. We'd heard stories about these parts, tales of old growth and new growth mingling under the vast dome of the night sky, and we wanted to experience it for ourselves. The forest was a curious blend of time. Most of the trees were relatively young, only about 150 years old, a legacy of the rampant lumbering during the gold rush of 1849. Yet every so often, you'd come upon ancient oaks, 200-year-old giants, with thick, spidering branches and moss clinging to their rugged bark, as if to hide the scars of centuries. That evening, dusk was settling over the land, and the light of day was surrendering to the encroaching dark. The sky above was an ink-dark canvas, devoid of the usual chatter of stars, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath in anticipation. My mother led the way, her sensible boots crunching softly on the gravelly road as we moved deeper into the forest. My sister and I trailed behind, our conversation hushed, almost reverent, as we soaked in the uncanny beauty of our surroundings. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and the faint, sweet aroma of wild manzanita that lined the roadside. We walked beneath one of those ancient oaks, its gnarled limbs reaching high above us and casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. The trees around us stood in silhouette against the fading light, their outlines both comforting and strangely ominous. I remember feeling a slight shiver as the cool air brushed against my skin, a sensation that was both exhilarating and unsettling at the same time. It was as if the forest itself were alive, watching us with unseen eyes, guarding its secrets jealously. As we continued along the road, the atmosphere grew thicker, the gloom deepening until the boundary between the tangible and the spectral seemed to blur. I recall that moment so vividly. We had reached a bend where the road narrowed and was flanked by dense thickets of manzanita bushes. The foliage was dark and glossy, absorbing the little light that filtered through the canopy above. My mother's soft footsteps were the only sound breaking the silence, interspersed with the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. The world felt suspended in time, a pause in the relentless march of night. Then, without any warning, the tranquility shattered. Out of the murky undergrowth ahead, a sudden movement caught my eye. I froze in place, my heart beginning to beat faster in my chest. One by one, small, rounded shapes began to emerge from the bushes. They moved with an odd, almost comical rhythm, hopping along the ground like tiny specters, as if they were summoned by some unspoken command. There were 8 of them, each no taller than my ankle, and they moved with an eerie precision that belied their diminutive size. The creatures were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Their bodies were plump and round, reminiscent of ancient gravestones weathered by time, yet soft to the eye with a fluffiness that made them appear almost inviting. But it was their eyes that struck me the most. Each one had 2 enormous eyes that dominated its little face, glowing with an uncanny intensity. Those eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to absorb the surrounding darkness and reflect it back with a ghostly luminescence. I remember the way they stared directly ahead, as if they were aware of our presence, cataloging every detail with silent curiosity. My sister let out a barely audible gasp, and my mother's hand instinctively reached for the keychain flashlight that she always carried. In that moment, the mundane world and the realm of the uncanny collided. The beam of the flashlight sliced through the deep gloom, illuminating the 8 creatures as they continued their slow, deliberate march along the edge of the road. The light revealed the full extent of their odd, almost surreal features. The rounded bodies, the disproportionate eyes, and the way they moved as if they were dancing to a tune only they could hear. Time seemed to slow as we stood there, frozen in a mixture of awe and dread. My mind raced with conflicting emotions. A part of me wanted to run back to the safety of our car, while another part felt an inexplicable pull, a desire to watch and understand this bizarre encounter. I could almost hear the soft rustling of the manzanita leaves as the creatures filtered up into the road, their presence both benign and unsettling. It was as if they were the guardians of the forest's forgotten memories, tasked with a silent vigil that had spanned generations. For a long moment, we were all face to face with these 8 fluffy owlets, creatures that defied logical explanation, yet felt deeply intertwined with the ancient rhythm of the land. My mother's eyes, usually so steady and assured, betrayed a flicker of uncertainty as she held the flashlight, its beam trembling slightly in her hand. My sister and I exchanged a look, our shared silence speaking volumes about the surrealness of the moment. There was a strange, almost palpable energy in the air, a mixture of the natural and the supernatural, as if the forest had opened a small window into a hidden world that most people never get to see. I remember feeling as though the forest had whispered an invitation, urging us to witness something precious and otherworldly, something that existed beyond the boundaries of everyday life. The creatures, with their large, soulful eyes, seemed to carry with them a silent message, a reminder that nature is full of mysteries, waiting to reveal themselves to those who are willing to see. Even as I stood there, rooted to the spot, a part of me longed to reach out and touch one of them, to bridge the gap between our world and theirs. But instinct, that ancient part of us all, told me to hold back, to respect the delicate balance of that moment. As quickly as they had appeared, the owlets began to disperse. Their tiny forms hopped away with a soft, almost musical cadence, disappearing back into the dense foliage from which they had emerged. The flashlight beam wavered slightly as my mother followed their movement, trying to capture one last glimpse of their ethereal presence. The road returned to its previous state of solitude, the only sounds the distant rustling of leaves and the soft echo of our collective breath. It felt as if the forest had momentarily allowed us to glimpse its hidden heart, only to retreat into its secretive depths once more. In the aftermath of that encounter, a profound stillness settled over us. We continued our walk in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The beauty of the ancient oaks and the subtle interplay of light and shadow that had once seemed so ordinary now took on an entirely different quality, a sense of sacred mystery that resonated deep within our souls. I found myself retracing the steps of that bizarre moment in my mind, analyzing every detail, the way the owlets moved, the soft sound of their hopping, the way their eyes seemed to glow in the dark. I wondered if they were messengers of the forest, keepers of secrets too profound for the uninitiated to comprehend. My mother later explained that the region was known for its rich biodiversity and peculiar wildlife behaviors, attributing our encounter to a rare but natural phenomenon. But even as she spoke, I could sense that she too had been changed by that experience. My sister and I exchanged glances, a silent agreement passing between us that some moments are beyond explanation, beyond the reach of science or rational thought. That night, under the ink-dark sky punctuated only by the occasional flicker of starlight, I learned that there is a world beneath the surface of our everyday reality, a world where ancient trees, mysterious creatures, and the timeless pulse of nature converge in an unforgettable dance of wonder and fear. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the image of those 8 owlets from my mind. Every time I walked near an old tree or passed by a thicket of manzanita, I half expected to see a pair of enormous eyes peering at me from the shadows. I started to notice the subtle sounds of the forest in a new light. The gentle rustling of leaves, the soft whisper of the wind, and even the distant hoot of an owl took on an eerie, almost orchestral quality. It was as if the forest had become a living, breathing entity that communicated in a language of mystery, each sound and movement laden with meaning. Over time, I came to view that night not as an isolated incident, but as a glimpse into a deeper connection with nature. The encounter with the owlets had awakened something inside me, a realization that the natural world is full of wonders that defy our neat categorizations. It reminded me that even in a place as seemingly ordinary as a rural stretch of Northern California, magic and mystery lurk beneath the surface, waiting for those brave enough to venture into the twilight. I still sometimes return to that road in my dreams, walking beneath ancient oaks with branches outstretched like silent guardians. And in the stillness of those nocturnal wanderings, I occasionally catch a fleeting glimpse of something small and round, its eyes aglow with an otherworldly light. In those moments, I remember that night with a mix of awe and a gentle, lingering unease, a reminder that the boundary between the known and the unknown is often as thin as a whisper in the dark. That night in the forest taught me a valuable lesson about the nature of wonder and fear. It showed me that sometimes, when we open our eyes to the mysteries around us, the world reveals its hidden beauty in the most unexpected ways. And though I've spent many nights since then under the safety of familiar lights, I never quite lost the thrill of that encounter, nor the quiet understanding that, even in our modern, rational world, there are still places where the extraordinary thrives, just waiting to be discovered by those who dare to see. Redditor 6. I've never told anyone this before, but my time working mornings alone at the pizza place in college was like living in two different worlds. Every day, before the first light of dawn broke over campus, I would unlock the door to the small, aging pizzeria and step into a world of quiet routine, until I started feeling that unmistakable presence. At first it was subtle, a gentle awareness that I wasn't completely alone. I'd be kneading dough or sliding fresh pizzas into the oven when I'd sense someone watching me from the shadows. The feeling was so soft, it could have been nothing more than the creaks of the old building or the whir of the refrigerator, but it lingered in the back of my mind like a whispered secret. I was the only one working those early hours, and for a long time, I tried to dismiss it as my overactive imagination. But as the weeks went by, the presence grew more distinct. I began to notice a male figure in the periphery of my vision, a shadowy shape that hovered at the edge of the kitchen. It was as if a man, perhaps a ghost from another time, had taken a particular interest in watching me work. He never interfered with my routine, but I could feel his eyes on me, a silent observer in the dim light. At first, I welcomed the idea with a mix of curiosity and unease, even finding a bizarre sort of comfort in the notion that I wasn't entirely alone. I would say to myself, it's just him, checking on me, as if his presence somehow lent an air of protection to the lonely hours. But over time, his presence began to encroach a little closer. It was as if he was testing my resolve, inching forward until I could no longer ignore him. One morning, as I was restocking the counter with fresh ingredients, I felt a chill ripple through the air behind me. I turned slowly and saw him standing there, his figure partially outlined by the weak light of the early sun filtering through the back door. His form was vague at first, a silhouette draped in darkness, but gradually it became more defined. He was a man of indeterminate age, with the faint outline of a face that held both weariness and a touch of sadness. I remember feeling a mixture of apprehension and resolve. I was determined not to be intimidated by this spectral presence. "Stay back," I said softly, almost to myself, though I meant it as a command to the unseen observer. It was as if I was drawing a line in the air. The moment the words left my lips, the air shifted. The figure seemed to pause, hovering a few feet away from me, then slowly, almost reluctantly, it drifted back into the darker corners of the room. I never felt threatened after that. Rather, it was as if the ghost had accepted my boundary without further protest. For nearly a year, I worked those solitary mornings. The routine became a blend of mundane tasks and unexplained phenomena. There were moments when I would hear inexplicable noises, a soft murmur of voices that sounded like a crowded party coming from the dining room long before we opened for business. I'd go to check the source, only to find the room empty and silent, the sound abruptly ceasing as if it had never been there at all. It was disconcerting, but nothing I couldn't handle. One particularly busy morning stands out in my memory. The restaurant was crowded with the typical chaos of a college campus morning rush. Customers filled the dining area, the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation, creating a background din that should have masked any unusual sounds. Yet, in the midst of that hustle, I caught sight of him again. I was busy taking orders at the counter when I glanced toward the back of the restaurant and saw a figure standing quietly in the shadows near the kitchen door. It was unmistakably him, the same ghostly presence that had haunted my early mornings. This time, though, his appearance was different. He looked like an old man, wearing jeans and a button-up denim shirt that seemed to belong to a different era entirely. His form was oddly incomplete. From his knees down, he was completely invisible, as if he had been erased from that part of his existence. The look on his spectral face was one of pure surprise, as though he hadn't expected to be seen at all. I couldn't help but let out a soft, incredulous laugh, a reaction that, in the quiet corner of that bustling restaurant, felt both absurd and defiant. There were other strange occurrences at that pizza place as well. I recall nights when the sound of metal pans falling would echo through the back, the clatter sudden and jarring, only for me to search the floor and find no pans at all. In the dining room, before we even opened the doors to customers, there were whispers of activity, an indistinct murmur that felt like the buzz of a party in full swing. Yet when I approached, the noise would vanish, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. One of the waitresses even swore she'd seen the ghost of a boy in one of the bathrooms, so much so that she refused to clean it without someone accompanying her. Everyone who worked there had their own stories, their own encounters, but no one liked to talk about it much. It was as if the ghosts preferred to keep their own company, leaving us to wonder and then eventually forget. For me, these experiences never crossed the threshold of fear. The ghosts at that pizza place weren't malevolent. They were more like curious remnants of a past that refused to fade. They were part of the building's history, woven into its fabric like the faded paint on the walls or the creaks in the floorboards. I began to see them as silent coworkers, strange yet benign, reminding me that there was more to the world than the stark reality of daylight and labor. They had their own routines, their own silent shifts that overlapped with mine, and in a way, I felt less alone, knowing that they were there, watching over the empty store during the early hours of the day. Sometimes, during those solitary mornings, I would catch myself talking to them, if only out of habit. "Morning," I'd say as I set out the ingredients for the day, and though there was no reply, I liked to imagine that somewhere in the shadows a spectral figure nodded in acknowledgement. My interactions with them were never confrontational, never frightening, just quiet, almost respectful acknowledgments of their presence. It was as if by acknowledging them, I was ensuring that they remained part of the silent tapestry of the place, rather than intruders in my own life. Over time, I began to notice subtle changes. The presence that had once seemed distant and almost abstract started to become more interactive. I would sometimes hear soft murmurs, barely audible whispers that accompanied my routine. Once, while I was tossing pizza dough high into the air, I thought I heard a voice, a low, gravelly sound that might have been a chuckle. I paused, looking around the empty store, but there was nothing there. I continued working, dismissing it as a trick of the mind born of long hours in solitude. There was one morning during a particularly hectic rush that remains etched in my memory. The restaurant was filled with the energy of a bustling college campus. Students rushing in for breakfast, staff scrambling to keep up with orders. Amid the chaos, I caught a glimpse of him once again, his spectral form standing in the back of the crowded dining area. This time, there was a brief moment of clarity in his appearance. He looked like a weathered old man, his denim shirt and jeans giving him an air of familiarity, yet his presence was impossible, defying the logic of the living. The lower half of his body was completely absent, as if he had been drawn away into nothingness, leaving only his torso to stand among the living. He locked eyes with me for a fleeting moment, an exchange that sent a shiver down my spine and brought a wry, incredulous smile to my face. In that brief encounter, I felt a strange sense of camaraderie, a silent understanding between two souls existing on different planes. Even as the bustling noise of the restaurant continued around me, I found myself oddly calm, as if this was just another part of the day's rhythm. I continued to work, taking orders and preparing pizzas, the ghost RA's presence lingering like an unspoken companion in the background. After that day, his appearances became less frequent, or at least less noticeable to me. It was as if my assertiveness in telling him to stay back had re-established a boundary, allowing both of us to coexist without conflict. Looking back now, I realize that my time working alone at that pizza place was a period of unexpected companionship, a period where the veil between the everyday and the supernatural seemed particularly thin. The ghosts that haunted that building were not out to get me. They were simply echoes of a past that continued to resonate within those old walls. They were like the worn-out jukebox in the corner of a diner, playing forgotten songs for those who remembered their melody. I never shared these experiences openly, partly because the other staff members preferred silence on the subject, and partly because I wasn't sure if anyone would understand. In the quiet hours before the sun rose, with only the hum of the refrigerators and the whisper of old memories in the air, I learned that the paranormal can be as ordinary as the first slice of pizza on a busy morning. I learned that sometimes the presence of the unseen can be a source of comfort rather than fear. A reminder that in a world that often feels isolated, even ghosts can become companions. Now, years after those college days, I still think back on those early mornings with a mix of nostalgia and quiet amusement. The ghost R.A., with his silent watch and his fleeting appearances, has become a part of my personal lore, a character in the story of my youth that I can look back on with a smile. I've seen other things since then, things that would unsettle even the most hardened skeptic, but nothing has ever felt as gentle or as strangely reassuring as those quiet moments in the pizza place. I sometimes wonder if he still lingers in that building, watching over the place as it continues to serve the living. Perhaps on some early morning when the world is still wrapped in darkness, he will appear once again, just as a silent guardian of the forgotten hours. And if he does, I like to think he will remember the days when a lone worker with a defiant spirit reminded him that even ghosts deserve boundaries, that even in the midst of chaos, a little calm can go a long way. In the end, my experience taught me that not all hauntings are born of malice. Some are simply echoes of a life that once was, reminders that the past never truly disappears, but lingers in the quiet corners of our present. And sometimes, when you're working alone in the stillness of the early morning, the presence of a friendly ghost can make the darkness seem a little less lonely.